Our next speaker is Jean Dennison, an enrolled member of the Osage Nation, and is co-director for the Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies and an associate professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Washington. Her book, Colonial Entanglement, Constituting a 21st-Century Osage Nation, speaks directly to national revitalization, one of the most pressing issues facing American Indians today. She has also published widely, including pieces in Visual Anthropology, Polar, American Indian Quarterly, the American Indian Culture and Research Journal, American Ethnologist, and the Native American and Indigenous Studies Journal. Jean's current research uses grounded ethnographic methods to understand the most pressing issues facing the Osage Nation government today. The primary goal of her academic endeavor is to explore how Indigenous peoples negotiate and contest the ongoing settler colonial process in areas such as citizenship, governance, and sovereignty. Welcome, Jean.
Have dahe, hudadoin shaji abri, tijo washtake, nikashi abri. My name is Jean Dennison, and I'm a citizen of the Osage Nation, and as she said, also at the University of Washington in the American Indian Studies Department, and also getting to co-direct a center that's just in our third year for American Indian and Indigenous Studies across the three University of Washington campuses. Importantly, I wanted to recognize that the University of Washington stands and I live on the lands and waters of the Lushootseed-speaking peoples, specifically the Duwamish, the Muckleshoot, the Tulalip, the Suquamish, and the Puyallup. I'm committed to creating a space for these and other Indigenous peoples to thrive through my mentorship, teaching, research, and service. And I wanted to start here with this land acknowledgement because I do think that these things are really vital. But I think it's also important that we go beyond this kind of acknowledgement that then moves on to very rarely engage with Native issues in the future. And instead really think about our commitments, right? Based on these things, what are our commitments in these spaces? And so recognizing not just these things as like a legacy that is past, but creating spaces for Indigenous peoples, especially Native peoples, to the lands that you're operating on to thrive today. So as many of you all are probably familiar, High Country News published an article that was very heavily and powerfully researched to look at directly trace out how colonial funds from the theft of Native lands, including my own nation, the Osage Nation, was specifically used to fund higher education in its origins, also in its endowments, right? So these are things that are really ongoing today. And in this moment when many Americans seem to have finally been jarred awake from their collective slumber, they're beginning to finally see the intensity of racism and even at times colonialism that undergirds America. And I think it's really important that some of our institutions seem actually primed to do something at this moment in time to recognize this. And I think it's so vital that we take advantage of this moment. So I want us to make no mistake that whether you're at an official land grab institution or not, you are continuing to benefit, we all are, from the direct displacement and colonization of Native peoples. However, I also want us to be really careful that our focus is not on only this displacement and dispossession, because that really furthers settler colonialism as this done deal, as something that is complete. Instead, we need to continue doing the important work of unsettling colonialism and creating new spaces. So the question is always, how do we actually do this work? So I was asked to speak today about decolonizing the academy. Decolonization is a concept that's most often originally attributed to Fanon, but many, many Indigenous scholars and folks in American Indian Studies have taken up this language in really interesting and productive ways. Because of my limited time here today, I wanted to focus on Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, whose important work argues that decolonization is not a metaphor, and it needs to mean real change, that it becomes really dangerous that when it's used as a metaphor. And this really means centering Native life, that is Native practices, and most importantly, the return of land, right? So it also, at the core of Tuck and Yang's work, is talking about a need for local relationship building. In another, one of her, I think it was actually from a talk, Tuck also helped me to think about this idea that we need to reject the kind of pushes that we're often faced to choose between reform and revolution, and that the work is actually fundamentally about relationship building, which neither of those often are fundamentally built on. So this is about creating a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue that pushes us deeper and deeper and deeper into this work, rather than trying to come up with a set answer and then enact it, right? Because that's where we so often go wrong, and it takes us often out of relationships as we go forward and try to continue doing this work. Also importantly, this work needs to be really deeply local. This is one of the things that interests me about this space and spaces like it, that are based in this very local way. And of course, it needs to be done in relation. Different Indigenous peoples are going to have very different visions of what this work is and what it looks like. And importantly, we don't have to figure out all of the details to dream and work towards these dreams. So I remain a little bit uncomfortable sometimes with the way that the word decolonizing often gets picked up, especially when it becomes a metaphor, right? When it's not about giving land back or supporting Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, which are really the core of a lot of my work and my research with my own nation, the Osage Nation. One of the things that I think so often happens are some pitfalls that I just wanted to really briefly talk us through, because I think it's where we most often go wrong. And it really gets caught up in this idea of settler moves to innocence. And this is that problematic attempt to most often to reconcile settler guilt or complicity and to rescue settler futurity. And so here what we often see are this sort of fantasy toward an easier path, right? Something that's like, okay, I can check the box. I can say that I'm done in this way. And so instead, often what they're working towards are, strategies to remove the involvement in or culpability, their own involvement in or culpability for systems of domination, right? And so we have to really be careful of these kinds of moves. Additionally, some of what happens is that folks are trying to relieve guilt without having to give up land or power or privilege, and without having to change much at all. And some of the dangers, of course, is that people get professional kudos or reputations for being self-aware. And these are really models of white harm reduction. And so I tend to frame my goal at the University of Washington less in the language of decolonizing, because it's a big word that I sometimes I want to talk about. Like, I have not yet been successfully able to convince the University of Washington, for example, to give land back, right? So, but I do really like the frame of creating space for Indigenous peoples to thrive, which, again, we can talk about whether that's decolonizing or not, if that's interesting. But to me, it's a frame that really helps me center what it is, what aspect of decolonizing, if you want to call it that I'm really committed to working on. And, I found that these spaces must be centered in community building and generosity, and that those are the two most important things. And so this is a picture from Wethlabalt, the Intellectual House, which is a really powerful longhouse style facility on the University of Washington campus that is about to be 5 years old, I believe. And it provides a multi-service learning and gathering space for American Indian, Alaska Native students, faculty and staff, as well as that other folks can use on occasion. But I wanted to share not only this physical space, but also some of the ways that we at UW are creating community and links here in hopes that this kind of work can also, that we can partner with folks at other institutions to think about how we can all be doing this work together. So the center, of course, has funding for our faculty, staff, and students to support their research and their teaching and their service. We also have funding to bring in Native knowledge experts, both as sort of one-time guest lecturers or speakers, but also right now we have an open grant for co-instructors to join us, or also to fill the needs of departments as instructors. One of the other cool projects we're doing is creating research families to connect undergrads and to research ranging from Southern Lushootseed language holdings at the Burke Museum, or Southern Lushootseed language holdings to collections at the Burke Museum, to also Indigenous ocean ecologies. There's some really cool other projects that are happening as well around water rights. And then finally, I'll just say that we're also planning a pedagogy summit for mid-March to bring together Native Nation leaders in education and faculty from regional universities and community colleges to talk about different pathways. So this would be something I would love to talk to folks more about if you're interested. So I will go ahead and pause it there.
Thank you, Jean.